This event is taking place on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous people, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose presence marks this territory on which peoples of the world now gather. And in acknowledging the land and what that means in the context of our presentation, we're recognizing our digital spaces should reflect commitments our institutions make in regard to acknowledging and respecting Indigenous peoples. And as this presentation will be made available online, this acknowledgement extends to locations of online viewers, and we encourage you to visit www.whos.land to learn about the Indigenous peoples in your area. So thanks so much for attending our presentation today, Accessibility and Inclusion Best Practices for Websites. And when we talk about promoting accessibility and inclusion in our institutional environments, perhaps our digital spaces maybe aren't always the first areas that come to mind. And similarly, when we consider how to improve our online experiences for our audiences, applying accessibility and inclusion concepts isn't always at the top of our list of to-do items. But recognizing the importance of accessibility and inclusion and what our digital spaces mean in our communities, I know many of us have started to take actions to make these aspects of the work that we do a high priority. And for some of us, it's become the highest priority. But what exactly does that look like for us? And by us, I mean communications professionals working in higher education. My name is Joyce Peralta, and I'm Manager Digital Communications at McGill University, and I'm really happy to be here today with my co-presenter, Jaylin. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi there, I'm Jalen Gordon. I'm a digital communications associate, and I work closely alongside Joyce to really help improve and enhance our digital spaces here at McGill. I'm also a former McGill student myself, so it is really important that I get to help our community create better spaces online.
Agreed. So thanks so much, Jaylin, for your introduction. So our team, Digital Communications, as Jaylin mentioned, develops and executes McGill's digital strategy, which aims to promote and support our brand and mission. And our team has expertise in many areas related to web design and development, but we aren't necessarily subject matter experts when it comes to EDI. And that's why we really appreciate the opportunity to work closely with our equity team. And you're going to see some of the ways that we work together in the presentation today. So where do we begin? Well, here's a snapshot of what our web landscape looks like. It's probably similar to many of your own environments. McGill has a very large, very decentralized network of websites comprised of about 1,000 websites on our centrally supported CMS and another 500 custom sites that are administered and managed by a total of over 1,500 web professionals. So a very large network that we're working with, a lot of people who are creating content, and a lot of the times challenges ensuring consistency with our best practices, including consistency and alignment with best practices related to accessibility and inclusion. So how are our best practices for accessibility and inclusion reflected in our websites at McGill today? So to start exploring the answer to that question, I thought it might be neat to start here with a look at how our web pages have evolved over the years. And for us all, to take a moment to reflect on how the focus of our work has changed in terms of how we communicate our messaging in higher education. So on the left, we have a screenshot of McGill's homepage circa about 1997. This is around the time that I started building websites, only 25 years ago. And from an accessibility perspective, it's not really, too bad. There's a lot of content on here that is presented in an accessible format. It's mostly text and text links, except for that really interesting throwback image of the Indiana Jones inspired treasure hunt graphic. But at the time when we were planning sites, we were thinking more about what we wanted to tell people when we were creating websites. Even though it's accessible, we were thinking more about what we wanted to say rather than thinking about how to understand and connect with our audiences. And on the right here, we have what a screenshot of what McGill's homepage looks like circa 2012. So just after McGill sites were migrated into our homegrown CMS, or actually from our homegrown CMS into Drupal 6. And at that time, when I think back to how we were building websites, I think about taking actions like things like learning to do usability testing. We were focusing more on SEO, and we were thinking more about, of course, accessibility at that time, and also about responsive design in terms of, how to present content on desktops and mobile devices. So overall, we began to think more carefully about how people were using and interacting with our websites, and we were getting a sense of processes we could follow to better understand their needs and requirements. But interestingly, also at this time, I think many of our sites became less accessible. And that brings us to the present day. And in my job, the actions I'm taking are much different than they've been in the past. So I'm thinking more about effective web governance strategies, how to foster a community of practice built around our digital standards, including in areas related to accessibility, and growing skills related to user experience design methodology. So basically now I'm not so much thinking about the mechanics of how the content is being created, but I'm more thinking about the content itself and how users interact with that content. And that's why I wanted to start with this timeline, because I realized in putting it together that the skills I've been developing lately have been a bit of a different focus than the skills I worked at developing in the past. So when I participate in building websites and online services, I find I'm reflecting on and asking questions related to topics and concepts that I maybe hadn't considered so much in the past. And I'm relying on the experts that we're collaborating with to help give me guidance. And on the topic of consulting experts, I'm again really glad we have the opportunity to partner closely with our equity team who collaborates with us on a lot of the work that we do and many of our initiatives. And it was our senior employment equity advisor, Andrea Clegg, who first pointed out this quote to me. It's a quote by Arthur Chan, who, as you may know, is Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Planned Parenthood. And it's a quote that summarizes our approach towards improving alignment with DEI practices overall, including areas related to accessibility in our digital spaces. So diversity is a fact. So we're going to talk about the fact of diversity at our institution in the coming slides. Jaylen's actually gonna take us through those slides. Equity is a choice. So equity is a choice we make as an institution, as stated in our mission statement and our principles and in our equity strategies. Inclusion is an action. So for inclusion to happen, we must act in an inclusive manner in our digital spaces, and there's no way around that. And the outcome of our actions is belonging. So we're going to go through these points step by step, and Jaylen, I'm going to turn it over to you to get into the next slide.
Thanks, Joyce. So as Joyce just mentioned there, we're going to start by looking at the facts concerning diversity at McGill. And it's so important to recognize these facts and embrace them really in the work that we do. And this is also very important because how do we commit stakeholders and clients that we work with to taking action with us? It's with data. And a lot of that data really represents the diversity of our community. So if we go over to the next slide, we have some data on racial and ethnic identity at McGill. So I'm sure you're all aware this is a very diverse country, one of the most diverse countries in the world, and a lot of that is reflected in our student body. We also have at McGill a very high international student enrollment, so that's a big contributing factor that we look at as well. So Canada's population overall includes people from over 450 ethnic or cultural groups. And while these stats, of course, confirm that we do have a very diverse community here at McGill, we know that there's still a gap between statistics in our student body and our staff and faculty representation. So for example, only 1.1% of our student body and 0.5% of our faculty and staff identify as being an Indigenous person in North America, whereas overall in the Canadian population, it's around 5% of our population is Indigenous people. So while diversity is a fact within our community, we're also very aware that we have some work to do. The second slide that I wanted to present to you guys about diversity at McGill is students with disabilities. And like many universities, McGill has a sizable and also increasingly growing community of students with disabilities. And as we all know, these students face many barriers that make their experience more difficult, both in the physical and digital realms. However, we as digital communicators, I feel like we have a really big opportunity here to create spaces that are equitable and welcoming for all people. But of course, this takes effort and dedication. And this brings us to our next point. Equity is a choice. How do our institutions make it a choice to prioritize equity? And how is this reflected in our institutional strategies? So first, let's look at this from a very high level, all the way up at the mission statements and statement of values and principles of McGill University. And so we did a quick look around at other institutions, and we noticed that McGill is not unique in their approach to focusing on equity and inclusiveness, which are the two words that we've highlighted there in the mission statement for you. We've noticed this is repeated across many universities. So beyond McGill's mission statement, looking a little bit deeper into some of our policies, McGill's choice for equity is further defined in some of the strategic documents by our teams in our university community. So currently we have 3. We have our EDI strategic plan, which defines measures that will be taken to enhance diversity and also ensure equitable opportunities and a sense of belonging from within our community. We have the McGill Action Plan to address anti-Black racism, which has established a process of acknowledgement for our university's historic connections to the transatlantic slave trade and its enduring legacies. And then we also have the university's Provost Task Force on Indigenous Studies and Indigenous Education, which has set a series of 52 calls to actions for recognition and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. And so what do our institutional best practices and these documents that you've just seen say about how we should be building websites? We know from surveys we've conducted that our strategic documents discuss our EDI strategies at a very, broad level. And for our site manager and editor network, there isn't much content that provides necessarily direct guidance in terms of building websites in line with these documents and policies. And so what we do on our team is we try and fill in a lot of these details by including information about DEI best practices and accessibility best practices in our digital standards resource. So this is a topic that all of our team presents about quite often at McGill. And these are 9 standards that outline the criteria for creating and managing McGill websites. And as part of these guidelines, we've also worked very closely with the Equity Office and various offices at McGill to ensure that we're developing resources for areas specifically related to inclusion and accessibility at the highest levels. So I'm going to pass it over to Joyce now, and she's going to be speaking about our next point.
Thanks, Jalen. So we've talked about how diversity is a fact at McGill. We've discussed how we as institutions make equity a choice through our institutional strategic documents and in defining our digital standards and best practices. And now we're going to move on to some of the ways that we work beyond the steps that we take and how we encourage inclusion as an action within our community. So you have a number of community-wide initiatives that we've been working on in order to create a community of practice around accessibility and inclusion at McGill. One important strategy we've been practicing is to create inclusive environments is to partner with other departments in executing these initiatives rather than working on them solo. For example, we initially began pursuing ways to improve accessibility accessibility on our own digital content. And we mainly focused on ensuring the sites we were directly responsible for were accessible. And we produced resources for our audiences on how to create accessible sites. But we eventually came to realize that many other departments were producing super helpful resources as well. Departments like our sustainability office, who have guides explaining how digital accessibility and sustainability best practices are connected. And our teaching and learning services team, who have produced resources for creating accessible digital content, specifically for our instructors. So we've partnered and collaborate on an ongoing basis with departments across campus to produce this top level page of the McGill website, which has resources for the whole community, people who work and study at McGill, people who create content for our websites, all around the topic of accessibility and inclusion. Another aspect of how we are working with our community and empowering our community members to participate in creating our accessible spaces is a student-led accessibility audit that we initiated. It was student-led though, so we had student representatives who were available to work with different departments in auditing their websites, carefully auditing their websites, and then improving accessibility on their sites. And this was a really popular initiative that took place over the span of more than a year, and quite a large number of sites were improved as a result of this initiative. Another initiative that we have currently, we're about to launch it actually, is our student usability panel. With this initiative, we've put together a group of 13 students who are committing to work with us over a long-term period to help us improve our websites. And for this panel, we're very careful about ensuring that we have good representation. We have very strong representation from our population of students with disabilities. So we're very excited about the outcome of this initiative in general. And it's going to be starting up in September of this year. And I'm going to turn it over to, oh, actually, I have one more thing to share here in terms of community events. And that is our regular info sessions that we have related to various topics that are EDI related. So these are actually pictures from an event that we had during Indigenous Awareness Weeks at the end of last year, but we've also done a number of sessions related to accessibility. And I think Jalen's going to talk about those in a few slides. So I'm going to turn it over to Jalen now to talk about a few more of the ways that we encourage our community to be inclusive. Jalen?
Mhm. Thanks again, Joyce. And before we get into speaking about some of those other events, which are really cool that we've been hosting, one of the final aspects of how we can facilitate people's abilities to have a voice and be heard in our community is, of course, through research exercises. So one of the big ones that we have undertaken a few times now were journey mapping projects. But 2018 was actually the last time we undertook a large journey map project. And this resulting journey map provided some great insights for our homepage redesign project and revamped also our undergraduate admissions site. But in hindsight, we realized that there were improvements that we could be implementing for the next time around, which came around last year when we launched a new journey mapping project. So one of the areas of improvement was to emphasize really the experience of non-dominant groups, particularly BIPOC students, Indigenous students, and students, of course, with disabilities. These voices are really important to be included because they have unique needs when it comes to their digital experiences. So we connected with all these various groups through clubs and organizations across campus to really ensure that we got great representation from these groups. And the resulting product was students' digital journey map. And this is kind of what it looks like, the work in progress. There's a lot going on, but when you get to dig into it, there's so much phenomenal data that we're able to generate here. So Other than this, we're also taking steps to engage stakeholders from key projects that could benefit from the related resources that will be produced from this journey map, such as updates to our admission system, updates to our online course calendar, career planning services, and many more services here at McGill.
Thanks, Jalen. So here are some of the takeaways and recommendations we've gained from our experiences promoting best practices for accessibility and inclusion, some of the things that we can do. And we're looking forward to, by the way, having a broader conversation about this with you. So diversity is a fact. I think we mentioned our statistics at McGill. It's important that we're all familiar with the facts of diversity in our environment that we and the environments we interact with. So who are the people in our community? How do those demographics within our community compare with those in our surrounding community? And where are those inequalities? Equity is a choice. So to be cognizant of how our institution has chosen to make accessibility and inclusion a priority. What are our institutional strategies and how do they apply to the work that we do? And inclusion is an action. So what are all those actions that we need to take to build inclusive digital spaces? And that's the topic of this conference. And as I mentioned, one that we're interested in having a conversation about with you. And Jalen?
And so one of the main ways to achieve this is, of course, through education and through outreach and community building. And one of the important things, of course, is to ensure people have a general knowledge of how to create accessible content, but perhaps more importantly, might be to educate people on how these pages really can be created with an intent, with a very specific attention to accessibility and inclusion, and really provide shared opportunities for learning and interaction with our greater community. So one example of this that I can think of is back in November, Joyce hosted some great chats with our comms community. And one of the most impactful parts about these chats, which were really focused on accessibility, was doing a live demo of navigating some of our websites using a screen reader, which was really a huge eye-opener for many members of our community and really just hammered down how important it is to create inclusive spaces. So it really comes through education, but also, opportunities for shared learning. Otherwise, there's other opportunities to develop skills on how to apply accessibility and inclusion concepts at work that kind of encourage for our community continual learning and self-study. So we host regular workshops and classes on the topic of web accessibility at McGill, which are these pretty light, pretty easy, pretty fun, but very educational sessions designed to specifically accommodate our workforce in learning how to create more accessible spaces on the web. So I'll hand it over to Joyce now, and she's going to talk about belonging as an outcome.
Thanks, Jalen. So this is the end goal for us, is to ensure that every person in our community feels like they belong, creating a sense of belonging for our students, our faculty, and our staff, and for all who are part of our community. And for our education and outreach to have meaningful outcomes, we must help people to understand the significance of their actions. And that's a particularly difficult, I think, knowledge to achieve in a large institution environment. But I feel like it's summarized really well in this statement, this idea of what we're helping people, trying to help people understand, that representations here and now have real consequences for real people, not just in the way that they're treated, but in terms of the way representations delimit and enable what people can be in any given society. And that's a quote that's attributed to Richard Dyer, as quoted in Locating Queerness in the Media, and the quote comes from a document from 1993. So this is what we're looking to do at the end of the day. We have these best practices that we share, these resources that we share, but really it's the more human side of creating community experiences, and having a real empathy, and an empathetic understanding of the importance of the actions that we take. So we're looking forward to talking to you more, or talking with you more about this in the rest of our presentation. Thanks for coming to our presentation today.